I never wanted the cabin. It had belonged to my father's brother, my Uncle Raymond. He was a quiet man, lived alone most of his life, and spent the last 20 years in that cabin deep in the woods. No wife, no kids, no real connections to the outside world. He barely spoke to my father. They were close when they were younger, but as they got older, my uncle distanced himself. My dad said he had his own way of living. I only met him a handful of times, mostly when I was a kid. He never talked much, just sat on the porch of that cabin, staring out at the trees. I remember the way the forest felt around that place. Too dense, too quiet. It swallowed sound. Even when I was young, I knew there was something strange about it. When Uncle Raymond died, the cabin was left to me. I didn't want it. I had no reason to go there, no use for a rotting shack in the middle of nowhere. But I didn't want to sell it without seeing it first. Maybe it was some sense of obligation, or maybe I just wanted to get rid of it properly. Either way, I took a week off work, packed my truck, and drove up. The cabin was 4 hours from the nearest town, another 40 minutes down an overgrown dirt road that barely passed as a path. The deeper I went, the worse it got. Trees arched over the road, blocking most of the daylight. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low. The cabin stood there, small and weathered, exactly how I remembered it. The wood was dark from years of rain and snow. The front porch sagged. The windows were filthy, barely reflecting what little sunlight remained. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I didn't like the way the air felt. Too heavy, too still. I shook it off, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. Inside, it was worse. Dust coated everything. The furniture was old, covered in sheets that had gone yellow with time. The fireplace was filled with ash. A single cot sat in the corner, the blanket still thrown over it as if someone had just left. I set my bag down, shaking off the unease creeping up my spine. This was just an empty cabin, nothing to be afraid of. I went through the place, checking the pantry, the small bathroom, the closet near the door. Everything was untouched. Just an old, abandoned cabin. Then I found the notebook. It was on the table, covered in dust. A thick, leather-bound journal. I hesitated, then brushed it off and flipped it open. The handwriting was my uncle's. At first, it was normal, notes about the weather, hunting, the occasional trip into town for supplies. Then the entries changed. They got shorter, more erratic. I hear them at night, footsteps around the cabin. I don't think I'm alone out here. My stomach tightened. I turned the page. They know I know. I shut the notebook. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. I told myself it was nothing, just the ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time alone. But then I heard it, a sound from outside, a branch snapping. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Then another, slow, deliberate footsteps just beyond the tree line. I turned off the lantern, my breath shallow. The window next to me showed nothing but darkness. My truck sat just a few feet away, the only real escape if I needed it. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting, listening. Then finally, nothing. Just the trees, the wind. I forced myself to relax. I was being paranoid. The mind plays tricks on you in places like this. I locked the door, grabbed my rifle from my bag, and sat with my back against the wall, just in case. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found the tracks. Bare footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not animal, human. They circled the cabin, stopped at the windows, then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach twisted. Someone had been out there, watching me. I scanned the tree-line, rifle in hand, but saw nothing. The forest was thick, too many places to hide. I wasn't going to wait around. I packed my things, tossed everything into the truck, and got in. Turned the key. Nothing. The engine was dead. A cold sweat broke over me. The battery had been fine when I got here. I had filled the tank before leaving town. I tried again. The truck made a weak clicking sound, then silence. I was stuck. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel. I could hike out, but it was at least a 5-hour walk back to town. Maybe more. I told myself I'd try again in an hour. Maybe I had flooded the engine. I stepped out of the truck. That's when I noticed the hood. It was unlatched. My chest tightened. Someone had been in the engine. Someone had made sure I couldn't leave. I grabbed my rifle and locked myself in the cabin. I didn't leave for the rest of the day. I sat by the window watching the woods, waiting. Nothing. But I knew someone was out there. I waited until nightfall, my mind racing through possibilities. Some hermit living in the woods? A hunter? Or something worse? I double-checked the locks, kept the rifle close. Then, late into the night, footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. I gripped the rifle, heart hammering. Something moved past the window. A shadow. Then, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. I stopped breathing. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. Then, just as slowly as they came, the footsteps retreated, back into the woods. I didn't sleep. Morning came. I stepped outside, gripping the rifle with white knuckles. The footprints were there, fresh, leading to the door, then back into the trees. I had to leave. I grabbed my bag, the rifle, and started walking. Fast. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I walked for hours, the sun rising higher, my legs burning. Then finally a road, and a truck. An old man sat inside, smoking a cigarette. He rolled down the window as I approached, eyes squinting. "Where the hell you come from?" he asked. I just pointed back toward the trees. He nodded slowly like he understood. He let me in, didn't ask questions, just drove. I never went back for the truck, never told anyone what happened. I put the cabin up for sale, no buyers. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that knock, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting. I don't know if I should have come back. Something about this place never sat right with me, even when I was a kid. But when my cousin Mark went missing up here, I felt like I had no choice. It wasn't supposed to be a big thing, just a trip to check the old family cabin, look for any signs of him, maybe get some closure. He had been missing for over 6 months. The official search parties had stopped, and most people assumed he had gotten lost in the woods. Maybe an animal got him, maybe he fell somewhere no one could find him. But that didn't sit right with me. Mark grew up hiking. He knew the woods. He wouldn't just get lost. So I packed my truck, told myself I'd only stay a couple nights, and drove out. The road up was worse than I remembered. It had been years since anyone in the family had used the place, and nature had started to take it back. The dirt road was full of deep potholes. Branches hung low over the path, and the whole place smelled damp and rotten, like the forest itself was decaying. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low. The cabin stood there, small and silent, the wood dark from years of neglect. The windows were smeared with dirt. The door hung slightly off-center. I sat in the truck for a minute, just staring at it. Then I got out. Inside, everything was how I remembered it. The single-room cabin was small, with a cot in one corner, an old wood stove in the middle, and shelves along the walls filled with dusty cans and rusted tools. A table sat near the only window, a few mismatched chairs pushed up against it. I dropped my bag, stirred up a cloud of dust, and started setting up for the night. The first thing I noticed was that the air inside felt wrong. Stale, like no one had been in here for years, but also thick in a way I couldn't explain. I ignored it, chalked it up to my own nerves. I lit the old lantern, got a small fire going in the stove, and sat down to eat. Outside, the forest was silent. Too silent. I grew up around woods. I knew the sounds they should make. Birds, wind in the trees, the rustling of small animals. But there was none of that, just stillness. I tried not to think about it. I slept like shit. The second day, I started searching. I went through the cabin first, looking for any sign that Mark had been here. There wasn't much, just dust, old furniture, the same rusty tools that had always been there. Nothing of his. Then I checked outside. The clearing around the cabin was overgrown, weeds pushing through the cracked stone path. I walked the perimeter, looking for anything, A boot, a backpack, even just disturbed earth. Nothing. Then I saw the tree. About 30 feet from the cabin, one of the trees had deep gouges in its bark. Long, jagged scratches like someone had dragged a knife down it over and over. The wood underneath was pale and fresh, meaning it hadn't been there long. My stomach tightened. I looked around. The ground was disturbed near the base of the tree, like something heavy had been dragged there. The marks led deeper into the woods. I followed them. The trail wasn't easy to see, just small disturbances. Broken twigs, shifted dirt, the occasional scuff mark. It led me deeper into the forest, far enough that I lost sight of the cabin. Then I saw the first piece of clothing. A torn scrap of fabric, caught on a low branch, dark blue like the jacket Mark always wore. I picked it up. The edges were frayed, torn. I kept walking. Then I found another, and another, a breadcrumb trail leading deeper into the trees. I don't know how far I went. Felt like miles. The air grew colder. The trees pressed in closer. And then I found the shack. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof, built from mismatched planks, barely standing. The door was cracked open. I hesitated. Then I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Rot, sweat, something sour underneath. Inside, the shack was small, barely more than a few feet across. A filthy mattress lay in one corner. Empty food cans were stacked in a pile near the door. And on the wall, a hook. A jacket hung from it. Dark blue. Marks. My heart pounded. I turned, scanning the rest of the shack. There was a small wooden crate in the corner. I stepped closer, nudging it with my boot. Something shifted inside. I reached down, slowly lifting the lid. Inside was a pile of bones. Small ones. Animal, probably. But mixed in, half buried beneath the rest, was something else. A human tooth. My stomach twisted. I stepped back, knocking over one of the empty cans. It clattered across the floor, loud in the silence. And then, from outside, a sound. Footsteps. I froze. The steps were slow, deliberate, coming closer. I slipped to the side of the door, heart hammering. Through the cracks in the wall, I could see movement. A figure stepping into the clearing, shadowed by the trees. Not Mark. Someone else. Tall, thin, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing. Their face was hidden under a hood, their posture stiff. They carried something. An axe. I didn't breathe. They stepped closer, stopping just outside the shack. Their head tilted as if listening. Then, slowly, they reached for the door. I ran. I don't remember much of the next few minutes. Just tearing through the woods, branches slashing at my arms, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I saw the cabin, my lungs were on fire. I stumbled onto the porch, yanked the door open, and slammed it behind me. Then I grabbed the rifle from the shelf. My uncle always kept one here. An old hunting rifle, probably hadn't been fired in years, but it was loaded. I checked, hands shaking, then pressed my back to the wall and waited. Minutes passed. Then, outside, footsteps. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. I gripped the rifle tighter, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would shake my ribs apart. Then the footsteps moved, slowly circling the cabin. A scraping sound, something against the walls. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, finally, silence. I don't know how long I waited before moving. An hour? 2? The fire in the stove had died down, leaving only embers. I forced myself to stand. My legs were stiff, my hands numb from gripping the rifle too tightly. I moved to the window. The clearing was empty. I wasn't going to wait around to see if he came back. I grabbed my bag, the rifle, and ran for the truck. When I turned the key, the engine groaned, but started. I didn't stop, didn't breathe until I hit the highway. I never told anyone, never reported it. Some things are better left alone. But Mark is still missing. And sometimes late at night, I think about that shack and the man with the axe. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting. I don't know how to start this. Even now, after everything, my hands shake when I think about it. Maybe writing it down will help. Maybe it won't. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a few days in a cabin, alone, to clear my head. I had been feeling overwhelmed, work was piling up, and my life felt like it was slipping into some kind of repetitive cycle. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. I needed a reset. I found the cabin through an online listing. It was cheap, cheaper than it should have been for how nice it looked in the photos. A small, one-bedroom place tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by thick forest. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just a well for water, a propane stove, and a small generator for power. Exactly what I needed. The drive took longer than expected. The last stretch of road was a winding dirt path that seemed to go on forever, cutting through endless trees. It felt isolated, peaceful even. When I pulled up, the cabin was just as it had been in the pictures. Small but sturdy, with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney. The wood looked weathered, darkened by age and the elements, but it had a certain charm. The forest pressed in from all sides, dense and quiet. That was the first thing that struck me. The silence. I had expected birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of animals moving through the underbrush. But there was nothing. Just my own footsteps on the gravel as I got out of the car. I told myself it was fine. The deep woods could be like that sometimes. I grabbed my bags and went inside. The air was stale, like no one had been there in a while. Dust clung to the furniture. There was a small fireplace with logs stacked beside it, a basic kitchen with a gas stove and a tiny fridge, a single bedroom with an old wooden bed. Simple, isolated, exactly what I wanted. I spent the first evening settling in, unpacking my things, reading by lantern light. The quiet was almost too much at first, like my brain was struggling to adjust after years of constant noise. But by the time I crawled into bed, I felt at ease. That feeling didn't last. I woke up sometime in the night, heart pounding for no reason. The room was pitch black. The air felt wrong, heavy, like I wasn't alone. I stayed still, listening. The silence stretched on. No wind, no creaking of the cabin settling, just my own breathing. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not mine. They were in the dirt outside the cabin, leading from the trees to the porch. Barefoot. Human. My first thought was that I had made them myself somehow. But I had been wearing boots the entire time. These prints were fresh. Someone had been here. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. The woods were too dense, the shadows too deep. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old print I hadn't noticed before. Maybe an animal. But that night, I locked the door. The second morning, I woke up to something worse. The door was open. I knew I had locked it. I had checked it twice before bed. But now it was standing wide open, the early morning light spilling in. My heart pounded. I grabbed the knife from my bag and did a quick sweep of the cabin. Everything looked untouched. Nothing missing, except for the footprints. More of them this time, circling the cabin. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound. I considered leaving, but the thought of walking to my car, of stepping out into the open, made my skin crawl. That night, I pushed the couch against the door, barricading it. I sat up for hours, knife in hand, every creak of the woods setting my nerves on fire. At some point, exhaustion took over. I didn't even realize I had fallen asleep. When I woke up, the couch had been moved, just a few inches, enough to make a gap. The door was open again. I ran, didn't think, didn't hesitate, just grabbed my keys and sprinted to the car. The forest felt too quiet, like it was watching me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. That's when I saw them. A figure at the edge of the trees, barefoot, standing still, watching. I didn't look twice. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires kicking up dirt, and sped down the winding road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never went back, never looked at the listing again. and I never found out who or what was out there. I don't know if writing this will help, but I need to get it out of my head. I keep replaying everything that happened, over and over. Maybe if I write it all down, I'll stop seeing the images in my mind, stop hearing the sounds in my sleep. It started with a simple idea. I needed a break, time away from everything: work, people, responsibilities. Just me and silence for a few days. So, I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town or main road. The listing made it seem perfect. A small, rustic cabin, completely off the grid. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just a well for water, a propane stove, and a small generator for power. Exactly what I wanted. Place to be alone with my thoughts. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 20 miles were nothing but narrow dirt roads, winding through thick forest. No other cabins, no houses, no signs of life. Just trees pressing in from both sides, tall and dark. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how old it looked. The pictures online made it seem cozy, but in person, it had a different feel. The wood was dark, almost black in places, worn by time and weather. The windows were dusty. The porch sagged a little. It was quiet, too quiet. I stood there for a moment, listening. No birds, no wind, just the faint hum of my car's engine cooling. I shook off the feeling and grabbed my bags. The door was stiff, the hinges creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, like the place hadn't been used in a long time. Dust covered the wooden furniture. The fireplace had a stack of logs next to it, dry and neatly arranged. The kitchen was small, just a propane stove, a tiny fridge, and a metal sink. The bedroom had a single bed with an old quilt. I reminded myself that this was what I wanted: silence, solitude. The first day was fine. I spent most of it outside, exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, the trees towering high above me. I found a small stream about a 10-minute walk from the cabin, the water cold and clear. I sat there for a while, just listening to the sound of it moving over the rocks. That night, I made a fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple meal on the stove, and read by lantern light. Felt peaceful, exactly what I needed. When I went to bed, I slept deeply, undisturbed. The second day was when things started to feel wrong. I woke up with a strange sense of unease, like something had changed. The cabin looked the same. The forest outside was still and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. My brain was probably just adjusting to the quiet. Then I saw the footprints. They were in the dirt near the porch, barefoot, human, leading from the trees to the cabin, then back into the woods. I froze, my stomach twisting. My first thought was that I must have made them myself, but I knew I hadn't. I had been wearing boots since I arrived. These prints were fresh. Someone had been here. I scanned the tree line, searching for movement. Nothing. The woods were still, too still. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old footprint I hadn't noticed before. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, I locked the door. On the third morning, I woke up to the door wide open. I know I locked it. I checked it twice before bed. But when I opened my eyes, it was standing open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. I didn't move at first, just lay there, heart pounding. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I forgotten to lock it? Had the wind somehow blown it open? But then I saw the footprints again. More of them, circling the cabin this time. I grabbed my knife from my bag and stood slowly, listening. The cabin was silent. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing was missing. But someone had been inside while I slept. I checked the windows. They were all locked. Whoever it was had only come in through the door. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound. I debated leaving, but my car was parked a short walk from the cabin, down a narrow path. If someone was out there, I didn't want to walk through the open like that. So I decided to wait until morning when I could see better. That night, I barricaded the door with the couch, pushed the heavy wooden table against it. I sat up for hours, knife in hand, listening. At some point, exhaustion took over. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the couch had been moved, just enough to make a gap. The door was open again. My blood went cold. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my keys, my knife, and ran to my car. The forest was too quiet. I could feel eyes on me watching from the trees. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, heart hammering. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, speeding down the dirt road. As I reached the main road, I looked in my rearview mirror. A figure stood at the tree line, tall, motionless, watching me. I never went back for my stuff, never looked back. When I checked the listing later, it was gone, like it had never been there. The owner never responded to my messages. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing. I wasn't alone in that cabin, not for a single second. I don't know why I'm writing this down, maybe to make sense of it, maybe just to get it out of my head. I don't think I'll ever be the same after what happened. I went to that cabin to clear my head, to get away from the noise of my life, but I found something else out there, something worse. It started with a simple idea. Rent a cabin for a week, alone, no phone, no internet. Just me, some books, my journal, and the quiet. I'd always been comfortable being alone. Solitude never bothered me. I wanted it, craved it. Work had been draining me, and my personal life wasn't much better. I was tired of people. I wanted stillness. I found the cabin through an online listing. It was cheap, a little too cheap, but I didn't care. It was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The pictures made it look cozy. A small wooden place with a stone fireplace, big windows, and a wraparound porch. The description said it had a well for water, a gas stove, and a generator for power. That was all I needed. I arrived in the afternoon. The drive was long. The last stretch just a dirt road cutting through thick trees. The cabin looked older in person, more worn down. The wood was dark with age, and the windows were dusty. The porch sagged a little. The forest pressed in close from all sides. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just my car engine ticking as it cooled. I told myself it was fine. I unloaded my bags, took them inside. The air smelled stale, like dust and old wood. The furniture was simple, an old couch, a wooden table, a bed in the small bedroom. There was a fireplace stacked with logs, a kitchen with a gas stove, and a little fridge that hummed softly. The generator was already running. I checked the well outside. The water was ice cold, tasted clean enough. I felt good at first. The silence was exactly what I needed. I spent the first evening reading, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. That night, I slept deeply, better than I had in months. The next morning, things started to feel off. I woke up feeling uneasy, like something had changed, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The cabin looked the same. The forest outside was still, but the feeling wouldn't go away, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my brain adjusting to the isolation. Then I found the footprints. They were in the dirt near the porch, barefoot, human, leading from the trees to the cabin, then back into the woods. My first thought was that I must have made them myself, but my own boots were still by the door, clean. These prints were fresh. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Someone had been here while I slept. I looked around, but there was no one. The woods were thick, dark, too many places for someone to hide. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, maybe the wind playing tricks with the dirt. I forced myself to ignore it. That night, I locked the door, something I hadn't done the night before. I slept with my knife close. The third day, I woke up to find the door wide open. I know I locked it. I checked it twice before bed. But when I woke up, the door was standing open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. I didn't move at first, just lay there staring. My mind raced. Someone had been inside while I slept. They could still be inside. I got up slowly, knife in hand, checking every corner. The cabin was empty. Nothing was missing, nothing was moved. But the footprints were back. More of them this time, all around the cabin, circling it. I couldn't pretend it was nothing anymore. Someone was out there, watching me. I spent the day on edge, every sound making my heart pound. I thought about leaving, but my car was a few minutes' walk from the cabin, parked down the dirt path. I didn't like the idea of stepping out into the open, not with whoever was out there. I decided to wait until morning when I could see better. That night, I pushed the couch against the door. I barely slept, listening to every creak of the wood, every rustle outside. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the couch was moved. Not far, just a few inches, but enough. The door was open again. I ran to my car, knife in one hand, keys in the other. The forest was too quiet. I could feel eyes on me. The car started on the first try. Relief flooded me. Then I saw them. A figure just at the edge of the trees, too far to make out details. Still, watching, I slammed the car into reverse, flying down the dirt road. My tires kicked up dust and gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I drove straight home, left all my stuff behind. Later, I checked the listing for the cabin. It was gone, like it had never been there. The owner didn't respond to my messages. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I don't want to know, but I still think about that place, about the footprints, about the door opening on its own. And I know, deep down, that I wasn't alone in that cabin. Not for a single second.